like to thank Malaprops for hosting me here. We've all been through so much these past few years, and isn't it great just to get together in person and talk about books? I welcome my online viewers, but I like to hang out with folks like you. Well, I'm going to describe a little bit about how I came to be writing about Vikings, because if you haven't heard, this new series is set in the world of Norse mythology. And a lot of times people ask the question, well, how did you get to be an author? And I think maybe I was always meant to be an author, but I'm kind of a late bloomer when it comes to finding success or making a living at it. My first name, Cinda, actually comes from a character in a book that my mom was reading before I was born. And she loved the character, and she decided if I have a daughter, I'll name her Cinda. Now, as it turned out, big surprise to all involved, I turned out to be twins. And after they dragged my mother back into the delivery room, my sister was born. But I was born first, so I got the literary name. When people ask me, I do a lot of school programs, and aspiring writers will say, what's the most important thing for me to do if I want to be a writer? And what I tell them is read. Reading is to writing as breathing in is to breathing out, absolutely necessary. But writers read a little differently than most readers. Somebody once said that writing really messes with you as a reader. And it's true, because if I read something that really moves me, have you ever read a book and it affected you so much that you started to cry? And isn't that amazing? These are made up people. And yeah, so what did that author do that engaged us so much with the characters that we cared what happened to them? And, that's what every author wants to do. And I have to tell you that books changed my life. I wasn't a strong student in the early grades. It seemed like I was never in the right place at the right time with my homework, even if I had done it. And I really struggled, and they wanted to hold me back in the first grade, and my mom persuaded them to give her the summer to work with me. And so all summer long, we checked books out of the library, and we read and we read and we read. And by third grade, I was a fluent reader. And even though that didn't make me more on task, because it made things enough easier, I could be successful. I had my first literary success in third grade. I wrote a poem. It was called "Science is a Wonderful Thing." And the teacher framed it and hung it up at the science fair. And it seemed like the first thing I'd done in school that I didn't get yelled at for. And I thought, okay, maybe this is my thing. Maybe I'll be a writer. And I've been writing ever since. So I don't know if there are any teachers in the room, but you can make a huge difference in a kid's life by picking out that thing. I actually wrote my first novels when I was a teenager. I had a group of friends, and we were all misfits. Is there anyone here that was not a misfit? But we always feel that way. And we wrote stories starring each other as characters. And let me tell you, there was a lot more going on in those stories than there was at Cloverdale Junior High. So I've never stopped writing. I've been working since I was 16 at this and that. I worked my way through high school and college, typing and editing advertising copy for a newspaper. I published freelance personal essays in The Plain Dealer in Cleveland and other publications. I wrote scientific papers as a dietitian and a college professor. And you might think that, well, that doesn't have to do with what you're writing now. But the best way to become a good writer is to practice. Any kind of writing you do is going to be helpful. I once had somebody ask me when I was going to write a serious novel and, you know, get rid of the magic in the stories I write. And I've always had an affinity for magic and story. My mother's family came from Appalachian, Ohio, and there was a strong history of the belief that some people had gifts that other people didn't. And my grandmother was one who was said to have a second sight. And my sister and I, when we would go and visit, our favorite thing was to ask her to read the cards for us so we could find out. And that type of scene actually appeared in one of my novels, where a character who lives in Appalachian, Ohio, sits down with her grandmother and she reads the cards. And of course, she sees something very, very disturbing in those cards. When I decided to, I had several, like most authors, several unfinished novels in the drawer. And when I decided to go back to fiction, my sons were 13 and 16. And I became aware that there was this whole body of teen lit that didn't exist when I was a teen. I went directly from children's books to adult books. And some of it was really, really good. And some of it was a lot like the adult fiction that I read when I was a teen. So I wanted to write something that we could all enjoy. And having kids in school brought that period in my life back to me vividly. And I often tell people, nobody who can't remember what it was like to be a teen should write fiction for teens. If you're one of those people that say, well, if you think it's hard now, just wait till you get to be an adult. No. Being a teen is hard. And being one of my teen characters is even harder. So they say, write what you know. So I lived in Ohio at the time, and my first 5 fantasy novels were set in the magical world of Ohio. Small college towns, Appalachian, Ohio, industrial Cleveland. As my New York editor said, where is Ohio exactly? Is that near Iowa? So the Air Chronicles were my 5 books set in Ohio. But I've always loved high fantasy. Think Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or anything set in the secondary world. Sometimes you really want to leave this world behind, especially lately. I really wanted to try my hand at that. And so I have 250,000 unpublished words set in a place called the 7 Realms. And in the process, I developed a whole history and political system and old grudges and history. There's always a disaster in the past that propels the future. So I say it's like Lord of the Rings, but women have more agency. It's a queendom. And like Game of Thrones with more magic, less sex, more romance, and a lower body count. So I felt very comfortable in the 7 Realms world because it was kind of a quasi British, Scottish kind of world that relied on a lot of traditions that came from there. And as far as I knew, all my ancestors came from that area. And they say own voices. Don't write about an experience that you're not familiar with. So my people were Brits, Scots, Welsh, miners, and farmers. And then I had my DNA tested. And along with all of those other places was Scandinavia. And I'm like, what? Could there have been what we genealogists call an unrecorded paternal event? And so I decided I needed to look into this, get more information, study the history of the Vikings. I mean, nobody would mistake me for a shield mate. And some people think that if you write fantasy, it's a good excuse not to do any research because you just make stuff up. And that is so not true. If you don't get the facts right, somebody out there is going to know, and you're going to get emails. So it pays off to do your research ahead of time. And what I found out was that aside from that Vikings were not the violent barbarian raiders that they were in the eyes of the people they were raiding. They were actually small farmers and fishermen, but the climate and landscape in the north was really, really difficult. And there was no place, a lot of the land is vertical, so there was no place for second sons to start a farm. And so they raided in the summertime and then returned to their farms in winter. But some decided to stay. And at one time, I didn't know this, maybe all of you know this, but a large portion of Britain was ruled by Danish kings. It was in an area called the Danelaw. And the Danes primarily settled in England, Ireland, Scotland. Dublin was a Viking capital, as was York, or Jorvik, as they called it at the time. So there are a lot of people in Britain that have a genetic profile similar to mine. And when you research Viking life for a series, we were fortunate enough to go to Scandinavia this past summer, and I learned about Viking weaving and needlework and period music and the long ships. The Vikings were famous for their ships that were able to, they had such a shallow draft, they could sail way up the rivers. I looked at Viking food and drink. Mead has almost a mystical purpose in the Viking world. It was created by the gods, and it is the key to reciting poetry. They call it the mead of poetry. And I know a lot of people sing if they drink a lot of mead, but so I think one reason we have a lot of misconceptions about the Vikings is that history is written by the victors. And the Vikings themselves didn't have a written language. Everything was handed down in an oral history. And so, kind of changed over time. It was inconsistent. Gods changed names. And the first written accounts of them were written by monks at Lindisfarne, describing the destruction of their monastery during the Viking raids. Now, you can imagine that might give you a certain point of view about the Vikings. One Anglo-Saxon monk complained that the Vikings found it easy to corrupt British women because of their unnatural habit of bathing weekly. And in practice, the Norse religion had no central church that decided on dogma or what was heretical and what was not. Celebrations were generally carried out locally. So the first foundational documents were written down by Christians. Again, can you imagine if the Bible was written down by non-believers, by heathen, say? So again, there's very, very little to go by, and what you have is not necessarily true. But in the stories, in the Norse mythology, the Norse gods battled constantly against their enemies, the Jotun, which has been mistranslated as giants. If you've seen anything about Vikings, I'll be talking about the giants. Well, that was because the French word for Jotun sounded like giants, and that's the way things go. They weren't necessarily huge, and the Vikings intermarried with them, descended from them, and then they were always raiding and stealing from them and killing them. So whenever I read a history like this, I start asking myself, what if the good guys were actually the bad guys? What if the Jotun that we've been told are the forces of chaos, what if they were just creative spirits that were preyed upon by the gods of Asgard? And what if after the disaster of Ragnarok, the Jotun decided they were going to make sure that the gods of Asgard never rose again? So that's the premise. One thing I like about fantasy is that I can address contemporary issues in disguise without people jumping to the barricades or gatekeepers throwing up barriers. And in Viking society, magic or sorcery was considered to be the province of women, and therefore suspect. Male practitioners were seen as arch or unmanly. Even Odin was criticized for learning the runes of magic. And there's a character, Liv, in the story who's very, very frustrated with the role of women in the village where they live. And I'll read something from her point of view. "Give up your magic if you want," she said, in a voice like spun steel. If you give up magic, if men give up magic, they still run the councils, rule the courts, make the decisions, go out and raid and do important things. That's why magic is the province of women. It's the power we wield in the world. And I don't know why we would give that up. So it seems like a lot of my stories involve scoundrels of one kind or another. I've had pirates and I've had street gang leaders and so forth, so on. There's just something about somebody who treads along the border between evil and good. Not that I want to spend time with those folks in real life, but they're really interesting as characters. So Eirik Halvorsen is one of the main characters, and he's been, since he was 5 years old, he's been raiding and sailing with his father and grandfather. And he already has a reputation as a warrior and a navigator. But when his father and grandfather die, then he's left to kind of help with the farm, which is not something he's interested in at all. He wants to go back on the water. And then he stands to lose everything when he's convicted of a murder by a rigged jury. And it seems like the farm and everything else is going to be taken away from him. Liv Halvorsen, you've already heard from. That's Eirik's half-sister, suspect due to an interest in satyr or magic, and wears a mysterious amulet. Regan Eikeland, spell singer, musician, and healer. She's spent her life performing in alehouses, She is the thrall of a fire demon. And if you have to be a thrall, that would be a terrible situation to be in. He takes Regan's earnings, leeches away her power, and kills and drives away anyone who tries to befriend her. And so she's just trying to find a harbor in the storm and find a way to get away from Asker. So this book is book 1 of a duology. It's my 14th young adult fantasy novel. You know, I started late, but if you keep at it, I lived long enough. There's a lot more information about my books at my website, cindawilliamschima.com. There are maps of the world, which, of course, the map is in the book. I know somebody who wasn't a fan of high fantasy. When I switched from Ohio to high fantasy, they said, I just know there's going to be a map. And I'm like, that's a bad thing. I mean, I take maps of Ohio to New York City so they can figure out, you know, where it is, what it looks like. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I just started a Substack, which is free. My Substack is called Tells Lies for a Living. So I'm going to read a brief passage and then we'll open for questions. On a morning late in autumn, the year he turned 5, Ira Halverson was milking the cows in the summer barn when he heard his mother calling him. Ira, they're home. He scrambled to his feet, nearly kicking over the steaming bucket in his haste. He didn't have to ask who was home. Most other vessels had already returned to the village of Selvager for the winter, but his father and grandfather had sailed off alone in late summer and had not returned. Several times a day, his mother climbed the headland and looked out to sea. As the days grew shorter and darker and colder, he'd seen the shadows of worry gathering in her eyes. By the time he put the milk out of harm's way and released the cow from her cross ties and run down to the beach, the little ship was already pulled up on the sand and his grandfather Bjorn was wading back and forth, unloading. There wasn't much, none of the usual gold, silver, tools, and trade goods they brought back from summer raids. Something else was wrong. His father, Leif, stood at the water's edge, holding a little girl by the hand. His mother, Sylvie, faced them, her arms crossed over her chest, a dangerous light in her eyes. Eirik wanted to greet his father and grandfather, but the tension was so thick he didn't dare. The stranger had golden skin, chestnut eyes, and hair the color of comb honey. She was taller than Eirik, so he knew she must be older. In her ragged, moss-colored tunic, she resembled a landavator, a forest spirit from Bjorn's stories. Was that the only treasure they brought back after weeks on the water? Bjorn hung back as Leif led the little girl up to Sylvie. This is my daughter, Sylvie, he said, always a man of few words. He spoke better with his blades and fists. Her name is Liv. Liv is not my name, the little girl said, her voice quivering. My name is Hayden. I brought the gift of magic to Asgard and they betrayed me. I have returned to make them pay. Leif ignored her. I met her mother the summer after you and I were married. Now her mother is dead. He gave Liv a little push towards Sylvie. She's not dead, Sylvie and Liv announced to everyone. I don't need another mother. Nor do I need another mouth to feed, Sylvie snapped, looking at Leif. Leif stood his ground. Please, Sylvie, he said, she doesn't have anyone. I don't need anyone, Leif said, clutching the pendant that hung from a chain around her neck. But Eirik saw the tears pooling in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Maybe Sylvie noticed that too. She hesitated, stormy-faced, biting her lower lip. This girl has magic in her, Sylvie, Bjorn said, finally speaking up, and this world could use a little magic. Eirik edged closer so he could see the magic for himself. One side of Eve's face was puckered and scarred to the point that she could scarcely open her left eye. Her left arm also was shiny with scar tissue. Had magic done that? That was magic. He wanted no part of it. She's been through a lot, as you can see, Bjorn said to Sylvie, silent. She needs a safe haven. Sylvie glared at Bjorn, a look cold enough to freeze milk inside a cow. This is your fault, father, she said. You promised me you wouldn't go back there. Then she turned back to Leif. If I accept this child, she said, then you must promise me you won't return there. Sylvie, you must promise, she repeated, or sail away with your daughter for good. All right, Leif said, I promise. Both of you must promise, Sylvie said, looking at Bjorn. I promise, Bjorn said without meeting her eyes. I've heard promises before, Sylvie said. To make sure that you keep it, you must give me the sunstone. No, Bjorn protested. That's not right. Since when does his daughter tell her father what to do? Since her father breaks his promises, Sylvie said. I gave you the farm when you got married, Bjorn protested. You did, Sylvie said. So I ought to be able to decide who lives here, who I cook for, spin for, plant for, make butter and cheese for. I'd rather live proud and penniless on the streets than be shamed in my own home. All right, Bjorn said finally, the stone is yours. Sylvie extended her hand. Now. Eirik edged closer to the young stranger. What's a sunstone? He whispered, hoping she might answer when the adults wouldn't. Shut up, barbarian, she said. Bjorn fished in his carry bag and drew out a sealskin pouch. Reluctantly, he dropped it into Sylvie's hand. Now Sylvie shifted her gaze to Leif and the amulet. The girl clutched her pendant with both hands. No, she said. Let her keep it, Leif said. It's the only thing she has from. If she wants to join our household, then that is the price. You say she has magic in her. I cannot risk an 8-year-old sorceress with a grudge in this house. It took both Bjorn and Leif to wrest the pendant from Leif. She ran back down the beach to the water's edge, gripped the prow of the longboat, and attempted to push it off the sand and out into the bay. In the end, Leif slung her over his shoulder and carried her back to Sylvie, setting her on her feet, but keeping one hand on her shoulder to prevent another attempted escape. Give it back, Leif said to Sylvie. Give it back or you'll be sorry. Something about the way she said it made the threat convincing. You leave my mother alone, Eirik said, stepping between them. Such a wee, fierce warrior, Leif said, appraising him. Eirik, Sylvie said, quelling him with a look. Leif has lost her mother and she's far from home. Think how frightening that must be. I am not frightened, Leif said, glowering. You detain me at your peril. Sylvie stowed away the sunstone and the pendant, then knelt next to Eirik, putting her hand on his shoulder, but speaking to the stranger. Hello, Leif. Welcome to Sungard. My name is Hayden, she said. Sylvie searched her face. You have an old soul and no doubt countless names. But here at Sungard, your name is Leif. She paused, and when Leif said nothing, continued. This is my son, Eirik. He could use an older sister. Suddenly, Eirik found himself pinned by those chestnut eyes. Leif lifted her chin and looked down her nose at him. After a long moment, she seemed to reach a decision. He does look like he needs help, she said. I'll stay here for now. And from that day forward, the farm at Sungard became the richest, most productive farm in all of Mucklehome. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
How did you find your illustrator who did the beautiful map? And is that the same person you use all the time?
Generally, the publisher handles that. I drew the original lame map, and then my husband, who's back in the rear, he redid it on the computer, and then they gave it to a cartographer who happens to be British, and he did the final map. And that's pretty much how it goes. I work so hard to make a really bad map. I do, but and the same thing with the cover. The cover was done by an artist who lives in Sweden, and fortunately, I've always had the opportunity to provide input on my covers, which is good because I'm the one that gets the emails if somebody disputes, well, you know, why is he supposed to have blonde hair? Why is, you know? So, but I could, because a lot of authors, first time they see the covers when it arrives in the mail. So, yeah, so I've been really, really fortunate in all my cover art and in the maps. Ohio is pretty easy. You know, I don't usually get credit for creating Ohio. Yes.
What was the trickiest part of this book to write?
I'm sorry.
What was the trickiest part of the book to write?
The trickiest part. I usually have more elbow room. I'm used to writing books that are series that are 4 books long. And so I was grappling with the character development. I mean, my characters are teens, and, you know, Eric starts out being pretty much what you would think of as, you know, he's a warrior, he's a sailor, he's very impatient he tends to get into fights. And then over the course of the story, you watch him develop into something more than that. And so it was a little tricky to work in a smaller space. I mean, this is not a small space. I should learn to write shorter books. I don't get paid by the word, but yeah, so that is tricky. Yeah, I would say that. And because I'm working in a new world, there was so much to research. And there's a whole lot of people out there who think they know a lot about the Vikings. I mean, they've seen the Marvel movies. And they know that Thor is the son of Odin, and he is not. And Loki is his brother, and he's not. And yeah, so I'm waiting for the emails. Yeah.
How much of an outline do you use? And do you know the ending before, or do you know the ending first?
What is this thing outline?
It's a no answer.
No, one of my favorite stories about that, when after my 3rd book hit the New York Times list, all of a sudden my publisher wanted to offer me a multi-book deal. So I proposed the 7 Realms series, and I sent 60 pages, and they were like, "Oh, we really like that. Can you give us, how many books is it?" And I was like, 3. And they were like, my agent is like, "Great, can you give me an outline for each of the books?" And I said, "You know better than that." And he said, "Can you give me a paragraph?" And I said, "Do I have to stick with what I write?" And he said, "No, once we have the money, do whatever you want." So no, I wish, and there's no right way. Most of the writers I know, do tend to be pantsers. They just start writing and see what happens. I did actually have to write a synopsis for the book I'm working on now, just so they could be sure I knew how it ended. And somehow I pulled that off. But it's, even if I try to do kind of outline chapter by chapter, pretty soon it devolves into big battle or something. Just something exciting here. So, but yeah, I would love to have an outline.
We have a couple of questions from the audience at home.
Okay.
So the first one is actually similar, a little similar to Nora's, but about your process in general.
Mhm.
And Isaac is asking, what's the most difficult step when you're writing?
The most difficult thing for me is shutting down the editor in my head. How many writers are there in the room? Yeah. So, I read my own work. This voice in my head is like, this really sucks. Yeah, I know about those other 13 books, but you've lost the touch. You don't know what you're doing. And who can move forward when that's in their ear? So shutting down the critical editor in my head long enough to get enough on the page. I mean, I can fix stuff once it's down, but the hard part is getting it down in the first place. I do find that the editor in my head tends to sleep in. So if I get up really early.
So we have a question that's not about writing, but I think it's a great question. You mentioned your food and drink research earlier. Any must-try foods, and do you have recipes?
Oh, no, don't have recipes. I think if you are serious about researching the foodways of the Viking, I think mead is a must. There's several fermented dairy products that they use, and you'll see some of it now with the yogurt, some similar, but it was a way to preserve milk for longer periods of time. Lots and lots of fish, which, makes me happy. I think a lot of their preparation, though, was very straightforward. Drying the fish, grilling the fish. They did make flatbreads, and I did spend a lot of time researching what grains were available. For example, they couldn't grow wheat in Scandinavia because it was too cold, but they could grow barley. So when my character's reading porridge, it's going to be barley porridge. And if you don't get those details right, somebody will know. There's a lot of reenactors, cosplayers in the Viking world who have studied that a lot.
Last one from the online audience right now, until we get some more. So I'll ask that, and then we'll send it back to the in-house folks. Whose point of view do you most enjoy writing? Is there anything you can tell us about? Oh, I think you already answered this, but I'll go ahead and say it out loud for anyone else who missed it. Can you tell us about the length of this series?
What was the question?
The length of this series. I think you already mentioned it was a duology.
Yeah, it's a duology. I'm working on a second book in the series. The second book title is Bane of Asgard. And you can usually expect that as the series goes on, things just get worse and worse and worse. I know somebody asked me, why are you so hard on your characters? And they called me on it, readers will say, that's not fair. Very, very angry if I kill off someone that I love. You seemed like such a nice person. Yeah, so 2 books in this series.
And so the other question that person asked was, what's your favorite point of view to write?
Wow, I have a lot of characters. Sometimes I'll discover that I just really love a character's point of view. There was a character in the Air Chronicles named Leisha Middleton, and she was a villain pretty much in the first book or 2. She was a wizard who was secretly infiltrated the high school trying to find this hidden warrior that was there. But she was just so snarky, and she said whatever she thought, and it was just so much fun to write her. I kept finding her jobs to do as the series went on, and she just kept reappearing. And then, of course, finally, there's a redemption story. And that is one of the serendipitous things that happen when you don't do too much planning ahead of time, because you discover things as you go along that are sometimes a lot more creative than you would come up with if you had a recipe to follow.
We do have another question here, but I want to send it back to the folks in the store first.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So throughout your day, you're just doing your regular day stuff, how many ideas pop in your head? Like, oh my gosh, I think so-and-so book should do this, or.
Not as often as I'd like. I think it'd be wonderful. I know people are saying, oh yeah, my characters talk to me all the time.
Right.
And I'm like shaking my characters, trying to get, God, say something, do something. You know, they're sometimes very stubborn. So yeah, I mean, a lot of times ideas come first thing in the morning. If I have the opportunity to lie in bed, again, the editor in my head is asleep and ideas will flow. It's kind of a twilight zone where anything's possible. And so that's a good time. And then a lot of times things as I'm writing, I'll, oh, wouldn't it be cool if really so-and-so was so-and-so else? I try to interlink my characters so there's more than one connection between them. And I also try to, I mean, believe it or not, anybody who looks at my books is gonna say, you've got a heck of a lot of characters in there. But anytime, I always tell aspiring writers, pretend that they're the cast of a film that you're making and they're all on salary. So you're gonna cut down the size of that cast as much as you can, so you don't have to pay them as much. And because once you have characters, you have to give them things to do. You have to try to make them distinctive from each other, so people aren't like, wait a minute, who's that? And, I keep track of names and descriptions. I learned my lesson when I had this Alicia that I mentioned. I never planned to bring her back, so I didn't take good notes. And of course, I had a reader write to me and say, I'm just wondering, I mean, Alicia had different colored eyes in every book. And yeah, so. Oh, yeah. What?
Do you have any endings that you would like to rewrite? Thinking about it afterwards, saying, oh, wow, I wish I had killed off that character.
Well, I definitely had that, but I killed that character off at the beginning, which made huge numbers of people put the book down. I mean, I actually had to write a blog about it because I was so tired of answering emails that are like, how could you? Why did you? And this one beloved character, I mean, he was really dirt. I mean, I cried first, but they don't care. I'm saying, you don't understand what it's like. Yes, you didn't have to do it. I even had somebody who has read this book say, oh, I really enjoyed it. I, very much a Chima book in Norse mythology. But I really thought there was more humor with Han Alistair. And I said, great, I'll try to introduce some lighthearted fun amid the slaughter. Yeah, so I did also sometimes you take, if an editor tells you to do something, you either you should do it or you need to be able to explain why you aren't going to do that, because I have more information than the editor does. And I had an editor that was trying to limit the page count of a book. And I admit it was a really big book, but I had a character die. Sounds like I do that a lot. It isn't just a graveyard at the end, but he died for a purpose. He died in a good way. And originally I had a lot of processing of that among the other characters. So my editor cut that out. And I had a lot of feedback from readers who were like, it's not that he died, but then it was like, well, Jason's gone. Yeah, and that was it. So if I had it to do over again, I would not have accepted that edit.
We have I'm gonna go out on a limb because of previous comments and say this is a fan, which is great, who asks, do you plan to return to Seven Realms?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, are you gonna go back to Ohio and do that again? Are you gonna go to Seven Realms? I'd never say never. I don't have a specific plan to return to the Seven Realms, but there are definitely a couple stories that I could think of that would be worthwhile writing. So possibly.
A little
Yeah.
Any desire to set something in the Blue Ridge Mountains?
Well, I need to get to know them a little better. And I don't want to get emails. I did set some parts of my stories in Appalachian, Ohio, which is the beginning of that mountain range. So I would love to, but I think I need to accumulate a little bit more local cred before I do that. Last thing you want is, how long do I have to be here before I can start complaining about other people moving in?
Have you ever get writer's block, and how do you kind of handle that if it happens? Like, what are your go-tos?
Okay, questions about writer's block. A lot of that has to do with that editor. And so if I can pin her down and drown her or something, it goes a lot better. One thing that usually works, I don't know if any of you are familiar with NaNoWriMo. It's National Novel Writing Month, which is November, as a matter of fact. And people all over the country commit to writing. It's basically 50,000 words in a month. And I don't usually NaNoWriMo doesn't correspond with my schedule, but I'll set a goal of writing 1,000 words a day. And they don't have to be good words. And that's what takes the pressure off. If you're not dissecting and critiquing and mulling over and massaging every word and every sentence, how can you get lost in the story that way? So when I can pull that off, that is helpful to me. And that, again, I think it was Nora Roberts who said, I can fix anything but a blank page. There's a quote from Neil Gaiman that I like. He says, I never know how to write a novel until it's finished. And then with the next one, it starts all over again. So what you do have is the memory of having done it successfully before. So that's helpful. Okay, should we get to?
Yeah, I'll give a last call in case there's one more question, but otherwise we can go to the signing. So anybody else have anything that they're dying to ask for the signing line?
No pressure. It doesn't
No
have to be a great question.
Right.
You know, you're like, oh no, it's the last question.
All right. So in that case, let's give Cinda Williams Chima a hand. Again to everyone here and everyone at home. Folks at home, will wish you a good night, and folks here in the store, now's the time to get your book signed, and thank you so much.
And it's, just keep in mind, if you're remote, there's still time to order signed books from Malaprops and enter my pre-order contest. The details are on my Substack. Tell us lies for a living.
Excellent, thank you for that reminder. All right. Good night, folks at home.